Hi everyone, thank you all for joining today. We're at the beautiful home of Tom Strange from the Carolina Music Museum, and Ieva Jokubaviciute is here with me to play a wonderful, extremely romantic piece of music that I bet none of you have heard before, and if you have, well, well done, because it really is a hidden gem by the composer Dora Pejacevic, Croatian composer from the beginning of the 20th century. You'll hear about her a lot more coming right away, but first maybe some music. We'll play the first movement of the Slavonic Sonata. That's her second sonata for violin and piano, which is very full of influence of folk music from Slavonia and that region. So, hope you enjoyed. And to learn a little bit more about Dora Pejacevic, the woman, her life, the composer, I'm very grateful to have Pamela Plevins here with us. She is the treasurer and secretary of the Powell Society, biographer, author. She co-founded and she's an editor of the Women in Music magazine. So she would be quite a person to talk to about Dora Pejacevic. Thank you so much for joining us.
Happy to be here. Yes.
Yeah, and first of all, I wanted to know, how did you come across Dora?
In a very strange and unexpected way. I came home one day from errands and I saw a large package on the front doorstep. And it looked very travel worn. And as I approached, I said, it was from Croatia. Why would anybody be sending me something from Croatia? And I'll tell you the reason why in a minute. But I was intrigued, so I opened the package, and in it there was the newly printed score of Dora's symphony. There was this wonderful dual language biography of her, Croatian and English, which was very, very informative. It also contained a CD, which was an introduction. Plus, they also sent me copies of non-commercial CDs, so I could really get an education, and that was wonderful. It was a wonderful moment. I had never heard of Dora, and I kind of prided myself on the fact that I knew a lot about women composers, but she came as a total surprise, and she came out of nowhere.
So who sent it?
The Croatian Music Institute. Mm-hmm. It came with a nice letter, and just explaining what they were doing. And at the time, they were really beginning to work hard to promote Dora. And they've done a wonderful job. A little bit later, I received information that CPO had started to record all of her music, actually. And I think there are 7 or 8 CDs now. And it was all wonderful. And they've been coming out incrementally. And I think we're pretty much caught up with her. So that was the beginning, and it was a good one.
Yes, and maybe you could tell us a little bit about her. She had quite an exceptional life story, just unique, really, from many respects. Maybe you could share a little bit with us.
Yeah, very unique. She was born to nobility. Her mother was a Hungarian countess. Her father was a Croatian count, and they were very prominent in Croatian government for many decades. Her mother was a trained singer. She was a pianist, and she was also an artist. So Dora had this already, in her bloodstream, we might say. Plus, her grandmother on the paternal side was very much a patron of the arts, and she loved music, and she did a lot to promote music in Croatia. So Dora comes kind of packaged with these interests and these gifts. And her parents, she had a contentious relationship with her mother, who was something of an authoritarian. And Dora was a child who was born with an independent streak as well, which seems natural for a family that was so accomplished. So she and her mother kind of blocked horns a lot. But when she was 12, she began composing, and her parents were not the kind of parents who would say, well, that's just, not worth your time. But they were different. They wanted her to study music. So they arranged private lessons for her in Dresden and Munich. And she went on to study more, but largely she was self-trained, in many aspects. I mean, she certainly had some grounding in music. And one of the really wonderful things about her early life was that she had an English governess who taught her any number of things, piqued her curiosity. Dora became fluent in a number of languages, very fluent in English. And if you look at the list of books that she read, you can see they're in English, they're in German, they're in French. And of course, Croatian. So she was a very fine linguist, and she also liked to travel. And she was someone who wanted to broaden her horizons as much as possible, particularly her intellectual horizons. So in her travels, she was able to meet people like Rilke, Powell, who became an important figure in her life. And she set some of his poetry. He was a journalist and a writer. And she set some of his poetry, and they had a correspondence. And so she broadened her horizons as much as she could. She liked the music of Wagner and Mahler, and she was a romantic. She was a romantic at heart. Early on, she developed a dislike of the aristocracy, and she wanted nothing to do with it. And there's a statement that she made at one point about it it's quite telling. I simply cannot understand how people can live without work, and how many of them do, especially the higher aristocracy. I despise them because of this. So you see right there's something going on. And she was very much a woman who was interested in the people of her village as individuals. And she was so interested in people that some call her a socialist. During the First World War, when so many other members of the aristocracy were being safe and comfortable, maybe not anywhere near any danger zones, Dora was down working in the village with the people, acting as a nurse, treating patients, men who had come in wounded from the battlefields or who were ill, whatever they needed, she was there to help them. And she did this for quite a long time. She didn't mind getting her hands dirty.
So she tried to become a professional composer. I don't know if that's even, yeah.
Really, she wrote the first piece, and it was 1913. She composed, she entered her period of maturity around 1913, so she was about 28 years old. And she composed the first piano concerto that any Croatian composer had ever written. That was a highlight. And she went on to have a number of her works, her sonatas, her piano pieces, songs, performed and published. So she was building a career. And at the same time, I think she was the kind of person who wasn't interested in adulation or fame. Her driving force was for music, something that she wanted to share. And during the First World War, while she was doing all of this nursing and other volunteer work, she began composing her first symphony. It ended up being her only symphony. But she was also, particularly after the war, she became more introspective and more focused on her interior than necessarily what was going on around her. And in an act of what apparently was defiance, she met the man she was to marry eventually, and she just decided that she was going to do that, and that would enable her to just get away from the family, get away from all of that aristocracy. And so she married at the age of 36. Her husband was a military man. She eventually got pregnant, and this is the beginning of the end, really. She was due to deliver her child. Of course, in those days, they didn't know if it was going to be a girl or a boy. And it's almost as if she had some fear or something was going on in her mind. So she wrote a letter to her husband, a kind of just in case letter, I think. And it's moving, and it's telling of the kind of person that she was. I hope that our child should become a true, open, and great human being. Prepare its way for it. Never prevent it from knowing in life that suffering ennobles the soul, because only in that way can one become a human being. Let it develop like a plant. If it has talent, encourage it. Give it freedom when it seeks it. So act this way if it is a boy or girl. Every talent, every genius requires equal consideration, and sex cannot be allowed to come into the matter. She was very much aware of the position of women and wanted, if her child ended up being a girl, she wanted her to have all the opportunities that a boy would have. And as it happened, her child was a son named Theo. And 4 weeks after he was born, she died from kidney failure, complication of pregnancy, which in those days was not uncommon. And she was a bit older at 38, well, almost
Mm-hmm.
38 to have had a child. So that ended her career. And I believe there is a sketch for a second symphony. There's a fragment of something she was thinking about as a choral work at some point. So I look at Dora and I think so much was lost. You know,
Mm-hmm.
it's like Schubert or Gershwin. They died in their prime, and
Mm-hmm.
Mozart. And I mean that's one of the tragedy. And of course, she refused. And this must have been made clear in her will or some way. She refused to be buried in the family mausoleum. She wanted to be buried in the cemetery with the people. And so she was. And her stone simply reads, with her name and the words, "Rest now." So that was, her final words were really. I mean, everything about Dora was unusual. As far as I can see,
Mm-hmm.
her life. And she was she was just like a meteorite in many ways. She was blazing through the world. And then the meteorite did what meteorites do. It burned
Mm-hmm.
out far too soon, and it didn't get a chance to travel.
And now we have the great privilege of having here with us Andelko Krpan, who recorded actually the complete works for violin and piano by Dora Pejacevic, and he's also a professor in the Academy of Music in Zagreb. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for inviting me to your program.
Of course, and I wanted to first ask you, so I'm now recording this from the United States, and here Dora's music is not often played at all. What is the situation like in Croatia? Is she more well known?
Well, Dora was not known many years. And I can say that from 1980s, when the first book about Dora Pejacevic was written here in Zagreb by Koraljka Kos, our musicologist, then actually started second life of Dora Pejacevic's works. And now I can say that many students are playing, for example, violin sonatas. Also piano works are frequently played. And for example, symphony was first time recorded and played 10 years ago. So luckily for Dora, Dora's fame is growing, and I hope it will still grow. Every September, 10th of September is Dora's birthday. There is a festival in Našice dedicated to Dora Pejacevic. So it depends year to year, but there are 3 or more concerts, and on each concert there is played at least one Dora's piece. For example, this year, 10th of September, there were concerts, but there was also meeting of musicologists. So they were speaking about Dora's music and about Dora's life, what is nice, and hopefully we will have another book about Dora.
So you were saying she was basically forgotten, but back during the day, was she sort of a part of a Croatian music school, or was she sort of outside? An outsider a little bit.
Dora was outsider. This is correct. So she was born, in Budapest in 1885, and she died in Munich, in Germany, in 1923. And her family was extremely rich. Dora was not really agree with ideas of her family.
Mm-hmm.
So she was, we could say now, socialistic, maybe in soul. And she saw these big differences between rich and poor. So she did a lot of social work. During First World War, she was voluntarily working as a nurse, and she was wounded, soldiers and civilians. So she was aware of problems in the world, what was very nice. And I think we can hear this also, this struggle inside her soul in her music. So from first pieces, she started to compose when she was 13 or 14 in Našice. This is very idyllic and very naive music. But during years, this music and this music language became stronger and more powerful. And for example, last pieces, she wrote 58 opuses in these 38 years of her life. This is very strong music with elements of impressionistic and I could say maybe also expressionistic kind of thinking, musical thinking. The same is with violin pieces. You mentioned she wrote 2 violin sonatas, first from 1909 and second from 8 years later, 1917. First is very optimistic, very light, very joyful, simple, beautiful, very, very popular now among our students here in Zagreb. And second one is different. It's maybe darker, maybe stronger in expression, and for me maybe more challenging to play. There are some virtuosic passage also in this music, and this is violinistically demanding, but still beautiful music.
Yeah, very. Also the key of B flat minor, the second one, I was trying to think which other sonatas are in B flat minor. It's
a lot of plates, yeah.
Yeah, it's quite rare.
Quite rare and for intonation quite difficult.
That's right.
This second sonata is written in 1917, so this is one of very early examples of trying to put folklore elements in classical music, in Croatian music. So before Dora Pejacevic in Croatian music, there is actually, I don't know any example of this. So second movement, you can hear folk song with this augmented second and empty chords on the fifths, and there is no third, for example, the last chord of second movement. And also third movement is based on round dance, and this is quite robust and no peasant, but heavy music.
Yeah.
So it's strange how today we can recognize this as folkloristic, and in Dora's time in Zagreb, many said, "Oh, this is very German music. It's not Croatian music." This is a question of perception, and Dora was always seen as somebody who is from abroad because she lived far away from center, from Zagreb. She was in Našice, and then in young age she moved for Germany. She studied in Dresden, in Munich, in Vienna, and then she actually lived and died in Munich, in Germany. So she was not in Zagreb, and her works were basically performed abroad, not in Croatia. So in Croatia there were some concerts because she was big name, but much more in Vienna or in Dresden than in Zagreb. So for example, her major work, the only symphony. This is 50 minutes long, four movements, really big thing. First was performed in Vienna and then in Dresden. And then in Zagreb, I think 10 years after her death.
Mm-hmm.
It was strange.
Mm-hmm. That's really interesting. Yeah. And do you find that her works, they have really like a Germanic influence?
Yeah, I think this is based on Beethoven, Schumann, maybe Elgar, I don't know. Also Wagner. She liked very much Wagner, but she read a lot. She read not only novels, but she read poetry, she read philosophy. She fond of Schopenhauer, Nietzsche, Rilke, and she knew a lot of prominent artists of that time. Not only musicians, also painters and actors, and so she was really a very bright intellectual. So she lived art, let's say like this.
Yeah. And do we know anything about? I know. So she played both the piano and the violin. Is that?
Yeah, she played chamber music. She, as far as I know, she never played solo, but chamber music like quartet, trios, she was playing on violin and on piano, both.
And you've played a lot of this of her chamber music, not only the violin works. Are there particular pieces that you would sort of recommend people to listen to that you think are particularly interesting?
For somebody who is listening Dora's music for the first time, maybe it's good to start with miniatures for violin and piano. There are 5 of them, and those miniatures are written throughout her life, from 14 years of age of Dora until the 4 years before she died. So in those miniatures, short, very beautiful pieces, we can hear development of her style and of her musical language. Apart from miniatures, I recommend to listen for listening both violin sonatas and piano quintets. From orchestra music, I think it's worth to hear symphony and piano concerto.
By the way, what happened? So she had a son, right? And then she died right after birth.
Yeah.
Do you know what happened to him or to the family?
Yes. Dora's son lived in Vienna, and he died, I think, recently, 10 or 20 years ago, and he had a daughter, and daughter is still living in Vienna. She married and she has another name, but I don't know the name in the moment.
Mm-hmm.
So as far as I know, she is still living in Vienna. But
Okay.
they are no musicians, they are not artists.
Soanta.